I want to start this morning by asking you a quick question. Actually, two questions. The first question is this: what is it about Christians in the current culture in which we live that actually elicits a response of respect? Are y'all gathering my question here? Okay, you're a Christian, right? And you're a Christian in this world in which we live today, 2023, Durham, North Carolina. What is it about you individually or us as a group that elicits from the culture outside respect? That actually might catch the culture off guard in a positive way, like, wow, that's amazing. Or might make the culture say something to this effect: look, I'm not one of you, but there's something about you that really does resonate, and I need that. Are y'all following? So are there any areas that you can think of where the culture outside looks at Christians as a whole and sees respect? I'm sure you're thinking maybe one or two things. Let me ask, and I pray, that we can live in such a way where our selfless care for those who may not have would elicit a positive response. Things like that. Let me ask the question on the other end, though. Can you think of things about Christians in our current culture that actually cause those outside of the church to see us, and it brings a response of disdain for us? Now, I'm not talking about the disdain that is gaslighting that basically ends up coming, and because we have countercultural positions, and I would say, obviously, the one that stands out in front is probably our sexual ethic is going to be countercultural, and so there will be disdain for that in some regards. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the disdain that comes because there's actually something inside of the way that we act that makes the culture outside aware of hypocrisy. You say this, but you do that. And sadly, when they look at us, they end up not saying, there's something about you that I need, but instead they say, I'm not part of you and I'm glad. I don't want any part of that. There's several things that might come to mind in that regard. I think of the view of the culture with the stereotypical televangelist, the one who comes on TV and solicits the money from those who are poor in order for them to live an extravagant lifestyle. You know what I'm talking about, right? Or perhaps you've got the scenario where the preacher or the church is making a morally restrictive position with their preaching, but when you find out how they live, they not only are violating that, but go beyond it. Or maybe it just comes down to this. We expect from the world a mean-spirited, you do me wrong, I do you wrong disposition, but when they see in Christians a mean-spirited response, not only to people outside the faith, but even to people within the faith, it can become very discouraging to watch Twitter exchanges of what Christians say about Christians. And frankly, what Christians say about those who are non-Christians. Jesus said that the greatest commandment of all, you know it, right? Love the Lord your God. And the second is like unto it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said that those on the outside, when they see you, they will know that you're my disciples, not because of how witty and smart and sarcastic you can be in your Twitter response, but instead they'll know you're my disciples by the love that you have for one another. So I'm going to propose to you that today's passage, along with what we looked at last week, are very practical outworkings of Jesus' understandings of these foundations: love God, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's speaking about how do we treat widows. By extension, it's those who are needy. Those who can't necessarily scratch your back if you scratch theirs. And it's encouraging us to think through, how is it that we honor those type of people? How is it that we actually care for those type of people and show compassion for them? And it also is going to say, how do we maintain a wisdom in the ways in which we do so? Now, this text, there's some oddities in it, no doubt, for the modern reader. I mean, when you read that at first blush, questions have got to be rolling through your mind, are they not? Like for example, are you talking about every widow once they hit that certain magic age of 60? Or, as church history often has expressed this, is this an actual order of leaders, widows who are set apart in an official capacity, a formal capacity? Or maybe what you're asking, and man, you just read it and you start wondering, wait a second, if a person who is a widow ends up remarrying, does that mean they're unfaithful to Jesus? Does that mean that they're nothing more than just a slave to their passions, that somehow this desire to be married, this desire to have a relationship, man with a woman, is this somehow dirty? Is it just the flesh? Is it less than spiritual? Well, I can promise you this, that this morning we're not going to be able to unpack every nuance of what those questions may be. There's a whole lot of cultural misunderstandings in those regards. And frankly, there's been a lot of church misapplication in those regards. What I'm hoping we can do this morning is look at the larger foundational implications of what this text is saying that help us understand, love God, love others, and do this in a way where those on the outside will look at you and say, I'm shocked in a positive way. I would boil it down to this, 2 words, care and character. This is going to be talking today about care and character. Actually, if we marry it with what we did last week, verses 3 through 8 are going to speak to this. It's going to speak to the fact that care exhibits character. Last week was primarily addressed to us as a church. And how do we look after the needy? And if there's genuine character within us as a church, then we will, in wholesome and good and right and wise ways, care for those who have need, particularly widows in this case. What we're going to look at today is going to kind of flip that, and instead of care exhibiting character, it's going to show how character elicits care. Are y'all catching the nuance here? The first one is, if we as a church have character within us, we will be ready to engage and care for those who are needy. But the flip side of that is if the individual who is in need is a person of character, then it will elicit the care. It will warrant the care that the church gives to that person. So, back to the original questions. What about us as Christians would cause the current culture to either positively react to us or negatively react to us? I would say this. If our character, that is, our changed life on the inside, that's accomplished by the Spirit's work of regeneration, based on the work of Jesus on the cross. I'm talking about the gospel and its reception. If you've received the gospel and you've been changed on the inside, then that change should be, must be, will be exhibited in our care. The changed life on the inside will work its way out in neighbor love. And I just wonder if we'd live that way, what would the current culture say about us? So here's the plan for the morning. This is what we're going to do. We're going to actually examine the text, and there's going to be 3 main points that we're going to see in the text. That's in the title of the sermon. We're going to look at patterns in verses 9 and 16. Like patterns for how the church and how the widow carried this out. We're then going to look at potentials in verse 10, and then we're going to kind of examine quickly the pitfalls in verses 11 through 15. So the patterns in verses 9 and 16, the potentials in verse 10, and then lastly the pitfalls in verses 11 through 15. After we look at the text, then I have a modern day example that I want us, because sometimes we actually need to see this worked out in order to catch what the principle is. And then hopefully end with a few applications for us right here at South Durham. So let's look at the text. Thank you, Gwendolyn, for reading this morning. It starts with an instruction, first of all, a pattern for the church. What does it say in verse 9 that the church is to do? This is addressed to the church. What is the church to do? The church is to enroll the widows, right? You see that. This enrolling is a statement about organizing yourself for care. There's a lot of people who want to say, you know what, it should all be just spontaneous and it should all just be like as you feel the Spirit move. And there is a place for the Spirit in a moment to move you and me to do something. But you know what? There's also a place for us to understand what our responsibilities are and then to organize ourselves in such a way that we can carry those responsibilities out well. There's a flip side to that as well. Not only should we organize ourselves for care, but we should also be thoughtful as we organize. Like, let's think through what it is to enroll a widow. And what Paul's going to do for Timothy here is give him some instructions for how is it that you should decide who should be enrolled, who should not. Are y'all following? So there's a responsibility on the church listed here, even as this text is going to primarily focus on the widow. The church should have the pattern of enrolling, of registering, of being mindful of, and making sure there's a plan to care for those in need. But it also goes further to what is the pattern that we see in the widow who is enrolled. It gives us a couple, actually 3 specifics that we need to be mindful of in that widow. You can see the first one, let a widow be enrolled if what? Okay, we hit that magic age, right? If she's 60 years old. There's a maturity that's chronological in this. This maturity that's chronological is actually important. I mean, it determines a limit on who all it is that can or must be cared for. It helps us to understand, kind of what some drawing lines here to just have a little bit of order in our organization. So the first thing is there's a chronological aspect to this. And we're going to discuss a little bit later what the younger widow scenario is and why that may not be what should happen so far as the enrolling of the church of this widow for care. So there's the chronological aspect, maturity. But it doesn't just stop there. It's not like once you hit 60 in age, I've lived to be this old, now I get whatever. What else does the text say about this widow who is 60 years old? Well, it first says she needs to be at that age, but it also is going to speak to the fact that not only is there a maturity pattern in her, there's a fidelity pattern in her. Fidelity is just a fancy word for it. There's a faithfulness in her. What do we mean by faithfulness? Look at verse 9. How does it describe her? This is fascinating. It describes her as a one-man woman. Do you remember all the way back in chapter 3 when we talked about the elder and the qualifications for an elder? What was the qualification that was one of the home qualifications? It was a one-woman man. So these are just qualities of fidelity, of faithfulness that need to be seen in this woman, that she's a one-man woman. Now, does that mean that if a lady lost her husband at some point early in her life and remarried and now is widowed again at 60 that she's disqualified? What do you think? Actually, no. It's a statement of sexual faithfulness, which will actually come to play later when we discuss some of the things about the younger widow. So this is a sexual faithfulness. It's a woman who is committed in her marriage to the man that she is covenanted with. Not only that, though, it also, in verse 10, as we move into that, what we're going to find is this, that this woman needs to have an others-first disposition. The phrase that's actually used there is that she has a reputation for good works. So this reputation for good works is actually going to lead us into the third quality that we want to point out there, and that is a quality in verse 10 of engagement. As there's opportunities to serve, this person has availed herself to do that. Now, reputation would speak to what? The present, the future, or the past? It would speak to the past. So this person who is coming under the care of the church as an enrolled widow is going to be a person who is not only 60, but has also manifested fidelity. Sexual fidelity within her married states, and also fidelity within her serving states. It gives multiple illustrations of what this is, and we're going to see that as we move not only from the patterns, but to the potentials. Now, don't get confused. We're using the word potentials. Does potential refer to the present, the future, or the past? And mentally, you think of the future, right? But this issue of future care for her is based in past faithfulness in her. See what the text says. Just look at it. Look at it with me. The text is going to drive us to understand that the present and future disposition of care and service for her is based in a past of faithful engagement by her. The first thing it says of her is that she's given to hospitality. Now, when you hear hospitality, maybe you're thinking fine china and just the right setup. Make sure that the knife is cutting the plate on the right side of the, is that right? Isn't it on the right side? Yeah. The knife is cutting the plate. So this is hospitality. That is not what it's talking about. The actual term is speaking to the lodging of strangers. It's illustrated with the second aspect of what this woman is showing so far as her engagement in service, where it says she's been faithful in the washing of feet of the saints. It's a person who's had her house open and ready and just given herself to the care of others, especially those who are in the body of faith. It's done in a way that is sacrificial. Frankly, this issue of washing of feet, we look at it as a high thing now, don't we? When I say washing of feet, who do you think of? Who? You think of Jesus. But you do realize that when Jesus did that, he took the role of a servant. This was the job of the slave. This was the job of the hired servant. So this woman has had a disposition of faithfulness in others' firstness, where she has actually demonstrated hospitality to the point of even being willing to care for the menial tasks for those who come under her care. It moves forward to the second application. The second demonstration of her faithfulness in this way is that she has cared for the afflicted. Cared for the afflicted. That is, the care is the giving of aid and the relief. And it's done from her own resources. Now, when I think about that from her own resources, I automatically think of money. Do you? It's like she's provided food, or she's provided some kind of clothing perhaps, or maybe she's given some. But there's actually a concept within this of more than that. In the time in which this is written, there's actually persecution going on. So it's the willingness to care, to give yourself at risk for those who are faithful to Jesus by providing hospitality and resource for those who are out there and have been disdained and rejected by the world. So has this lady shown herself to be faithful in her hospitality? Has she shown herself to be faithful in her care for the afflicted? And then it goes to a general statement once again that bookends that reputation of good works to say she's devoted to good works. This devoted is a word that means to follow upon, to follow up on. It's like the word actually could be imitate. It's as if I did good works here, which means I'm going to do that again here, and I'm going to do that again here. I'm going to imitate it. So you see a pattern, right? It's not the bargaining chips in the scale of balances of, well, I did this, this, and this there, so now I don't have to. No, it's a heart and a disposition of faithfulness that says, I did this because I care for others, neighbor love, and I will continue to do this, and I will continue to do this, and I will continue to do this. So there's a building of this devotion to good works. So here's the type of person that needs to be enrolled. Church, you have a responsibility to enroll her. But the one that you enroll needs to be one who's mature in age, who is faithful, has shown herself to be sexually faithful in her past, has also shown herself to be faithful in her service to others in the past. That then leads Paul into a bit of a sidetrack into not only the potentials for the one who will be enrolled and can now serve, but into the pitfalls that come if you don't put these things in place. So verses 11 through 15, to some of our modern ears, is a bit bizarre sometimes. We wonder, what in the world are you saying there? And is this even applicable today? But let's dive in and let's see what he says there. He says to refuse to enroll younger widows. Now, the younger aspect of this does have some of the same qualifications we had before, but don't limit it. So remember, maturity chronologically is part of it. And when you hear younger, you automatically think just below 60, right? But it carries more than just that. It's like Timothy has been asked earlier, don't let them despise you because of your youth. It's not just chronological, it's about maturity in your faithfulness as well. So don't enroll the younger widow. And it moves into several pitfalls when the church chooses to not organize herself thoughtfully and enroll ones who shouldn't be enrolled. The first pitfall is this, that this woman enrolled in this capacity, this needy person enrolled in this capacity, will end up with divided affections. Now again, I'm reading this and my questions are going through the roof. Are you saying that if she remarries, somehow she's abandoned Jesus? That's what it sounds like on the surface, right? But if you go 2 verses below that into verse 14, what does it actually tell her to do? To get married. So look, we got to read this with a little nuance. It can't be saying that if you marry, you somehow abandon Jesus. There's some kind of pitfall underneath this. In fact, we know from the scriptures, Hebrews 13 says that marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. So it's saying both you being covenanted with a spouse, that's a good thing, and the bed is undefiled, even the sexual expression within that marriage, a good thing. So do not hear this as that's dirty or that's less than spiritual. It's a good thing. It's a God-given thing. But Paul also in 1 Corinthians ends up telling us that there's a scenario there where, it would be better for you to stay single if you can. When you get married, who do you have to look after? Your spouse. When you're single, who do you look after? Christ. So Paul is saying, I wish you'd stay as I am. But does he end up forbidding marriage? Absolutely not. He says it's better to marry if that's where you're at. It was actually the false teachers at the first of chapter 4 who were forbidding to marry. So he's not forbidding marriage here. What he is doing is recognizing actually where we're at as human beings. This younger woman who is still, sexual desire is still viable and vibrant. There's a natural desire to have a husband. And in the context of the day, there was a new woman who was liberated from some of that stuff and able to go and, it sounds familiar, doesn't it? Go and express herself in promiscuous ways that way that ended up, I'm getting that fulfillment without the covenant. And even deeper than that is this. As that woman desires those relationships and opens herself up to such, the propensity and the ability to go and marry one who is an unbeliever jeopardizes her commitment to Christ and the faith. Are you tracking with what I'm saying here? Be cautious of enrolling this younger widow and giving her resources where she no longer has to work, and she can now go and seek out these things in ways that could possibly lead to an inappropriate not only behavior before marriage, but union with one who is not in Jesus. 1 Corinthians says it's absolutely permissible to marry in the Lord. So the potential for divided affection by providing this for her. Now, so Paul gives some instructions, and these are matters of wisdom, not demand. The instructions that you see in verse 14, what does it tell her to do? It actually tells her to marry. Marriage is honorable, it's fine, it's good. It actually engages her in wholesome industry as opposed to idleness, which we'll get to in a second. She is able to now give herself to the management of a household. Perhaps bearing children if young enough, but if not bearing children, definitely caring for husband and the household at large. And it also protects the reputation you'd see in verse 10, which is ultimately qualifying for her to be enrolled by the church, a reputation of good works. So the instruction is let her marry. There's a follow-up instruction that's actually a part of the pattern, which, hey, look, as a believing lady, go care for the widows that are in your life, in your network. Verse 16 says, if there are relatives that you have, please go and care for them. It moves forward, though. So there's this issue of divided affections. It also moves then to verse 13, where Paul actually says, and besides that, go ahead and make sure that you watch out for this potential pitfall, that they learn to be idlers. To learn is actually like to habituate, to do something where over time it becomes your habit. So what you can see here is that leisure has been afforded because the resources have been cared for, and the leisure is opposed to effort. I get my funds based on status and not on industry. And it says that these women, the way this works out is they end up going house to house. Now listen, is going to house a bad thing? No, it's actually could be ministry. But it seems to insinuate here that this going to house is going to lead to something. It leads to what it suggests next as a pitfall is this: becoming gossips and busybodies. Now listen, let me make sure that we understand here. This is speaking of widows, young widows who are at leisure. This stuff applies to men too. It applies to the unmarried. It applies to all of us. To lose purpose and industry and end up completely with just time on your hands can easily divulge into this kind of being idle, becoming a gossip, and becoming a busybody. Here's the word gossip there. You think you know what that means, right? The word gossip there is essentially to utter and do silly things. It's to be a babbler. It's to speak of foolish trifles. 3 John, verse 10. John the apostle is speaking to Gaius and the elders in the church where he's at there. And he ends up addressing a certain person by the name of Diotrephes. And he ends up saying that Diotrephes has engaged himself, and I'm going to confront it when I come, in speaking nonsense about us. This is the concept of what gossip is. It is the speaking of nonsense. Now you can see how this idle time, going house to house, could easily lead to conversations about trifles, insignificances. Usually those things pertain to, did you hear about so-and-so? Did you hear what they did? I would never. Can you believe? Hey, I've got a prayer request for you. And it actually ends up moving past just conversation. You know what? Let me say this. This is speaking to going house to house. We live in a day where there's technologies that allow this house-to-house type thing to occur without ever leaving a single spot. We can text. We can direct message. We can send out words on social media that are doing the very same thing. And it goes next to this idea of being busybodies. Not only are you talking about it, but you're actually busying yourself in these trifling affairs. It's becoming a meddler. And as this occurs, verse 15 is pretty strong. It ends up telling you that some have already strayed. And where does it say they've strayed to? They've strayed after Satan. This is not the way of the Lord. In fact, this is a massive weapon of the enemy. He loves to use our gossip, our busyness, and our idleness in order to divide us, to plant seeds of untruth, and to cause the name of Jesus to be in ill repute with those outside in the culture. So he's addressing these things. He ends up in the end, and we've already addressed this a little bit, with saying one of the instructions for these younger widows is to live in sexual fidelity. If that means marriage, marry. But keep yourself busy and industrious, not idle and busy-bodied. And again, I would say, men, you too. I think, I heard a Christian artist who recently said a statement he learned long before was, if you want people to know truth, tell them. But if you want people to love truth, tell them a story. So let me share a story. This person is one of probably hundreds, thousands that you nor I know. This one I happen to know. She engaged with the church that I was involved in, probably 20 years ago. Her name is Sue Singleton. Sue graduated from UNCG in 1959. She graduated with a degree in human and environmental sciences. She married. She had a daughter who now lives in Winston-Salem. But in 1989, 30 years after her graduation, she was widowed. Her husband passed away. Sue was in her early 50s. What should Sue do? How should Sue pursue Jesus? How should she live faithfully? Here's what Sue did. In 1982, she ended up going to ECU and got a master's. She got a master's, again, in human and environmental science, but she also had it coupled with ESL, English as a Second Language. So in 1993, Sue went as a missionary to Cambodia. When she went there, she was the only missionary in the entire province in which she lived. From 1993 to 2012, Sue lived as an IMB missionary. In 2005, Sue actually began a foundation called the Shelter of Love. It's a center that she began because she looked around and she saw the incredible poverty and she saw the incredible need of children who were orphaned or abandoned or going to be abandoned. So for 18 months, she helped cast the vision, which our church was a part of, that I was a part of then, cast the vision, raised the funds, and they built 5 buildings there in her province in Cambodia to house this particular ministry, the Shelter of Love. They end up having about 55 children at any given time, all the way from infants to high school. They have about 15 to 17 staff in place that live as house parents and educators and social workers. Fascinating. In 2012, she retired from the IMB. What do you think she did? She still lives to this day in Cambodia. She lives in Cambodia now. She was the dreamer and the founder of another international school there called the Clever Child International School. She's an active member of Kampong Tong, and I'm not sure if I said that right, Baptist Church, which is the area in which she lives. Sue didn't remarry, but Sue actually faithfully lived. And she wasn't 60, she was younger. She faithfully lived and invested, and is still to this day investing her life. I would venture to say that the character that you and I don't see from 1959 to 1989 in the way that Sue lived out her life in her marriage was the grounds for the potential of her to live out a life of impact in the years that came in her widowhood. So, what does this mean for us? South Durham women, and honestly, men, I would say this to you. The text is written towards ladies, primarily because the ladies outlived the men and the ladies were more vulnerable economically than the men. But I would say it to you men as well. Here's what I want to encourage you to do. We're not overwhelmed with widows among us. The ones that we have seem to be well cared for. And this is commendable. Families, you look after those that are yours. But I would encourage us to do this. Look around us and see if there are persons that we can pour our lives into and make sure that we thoughtfully organize ourselves to care for them. We don't have to go to Cambodia like Sue did. We can meet need with the heart of Sue for others right here. Look, I've had conversations with some of you, and I hear it. I hear it in your job place where you are dealing with patients or students and you care for them. Do not lose that and live in such a way where it's the reflection of the character of Jesus within you. You live in a way that neighbor love characterizes your life. What I want to say more than that is that be mindful that while we're looking for those who are needy, widows, or the indigent, or orphans, or those with mental and emotional and relational needs, we need to be looking around for those. Be mindful of your own self. Remember what this said, honor the widows who have a reputation of good works. You realize that you are establishing right now your reputation. Now, this is not talking about earning salvation. Please don't misunderstand. This is not talking about you somehow making God strong-armed into having to favor you or the church strong-armed into having to care for you. What I'm saying is live faithfully now so that when you are at the stage of needing care, God forbid, but if you get there, have a reputation so that the church, your character elicits the care of the church. Instead of the church having to sit here and say, is she just taking us for whatever she can get out of us? Is that, y'all, I know that's harsh in some ways, but we're building our reputation now. Live life that's developing character. Live life that is showing the change of Jesus within you. Live a life of hospitality. Live a life of care for others. So that if the time comes, the church is not just obligated, but the church is honored to step in, love, and care for you. If you're in the position as a widow now, let me just say this. You're not left to just sit on the sidelines. The scriptures speak of a lady by the name of Dorcas, who in Acts was known for her reputation of good works. She actually provided clothing for all sorts of people. Everybody in the community said, oh yeah, that's Dorcas. She ends up, she made me some clothes at some point. If that's you, jump on in and serve. Jump on in and continue. The admonition is for us corporately. South Durham Church, who are we going to serve today? And the admonition is for you individually. Who are you going to serve today? Look to the widow. Look to the orphan. Look to the refugee. Look to the person who's new in town. Look to the kid who's new in your school. Find the lonely. And out of the love of Jesus, love them.